Bridgeway Christian Church. I'm Brian Kiley, and today my co-host Lance Hahn and I are joined by special guests Tammy Vallejo and Anita Hodges for a conversation about sexual harassment. Recent revelations of sexual misconduct by a wide range of public figures have given unprecedented attention to the problem of sexual harassment in workplaces, the media, the political arena, and even churches. Why is this sort of behavior so prevalent, and how can the church be part of the solution? These questions and more on this episode of Engaging Culture. All right. Welcome to episode 15 of the Engaging Culture podcast. Like I said, I'm Brian Kiley, joined as always by my co-host, Pastor Lance Hahn.
I'm the other deep voice. How are you? Nice to see everyone.
Deep voice. We are in a recording studio this morning where it is approximately 45 degrees.
We will not be aging at all the entire broadcast.
It's not that cold, but it sure feels like it.
I know. I'm wearing a jacket for that very reason. Not to look cool, but simply so I don't die.
Oh, there you go. We are joined, like I said this morning, by, first of all, Tammy Vallejo. Tammy, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm amazing. Thank you.
All right. Good. Glad to have you with us. And Anita Hodges. Anita, good morning.
Good morning.
Would love to have just each of you briefly share a little bit for our listeners about kind of who you are, what you do, and then how you got roped into this other than the personal recommendation of a mutual friend of ours. So go ahead, Tammy. We'll start with you.
Yeah, so relevant to this conversation, my background in the corporate world is about 17 years in a corporate industry where I had an opportunity to actually investigate quite a few of these types of cases internally for employers. But more recently, I'm just a serial entrepreneur. I love changing the world for God's kingdom through business. And E49 and 210 Impact Hub are the two things that probably most people know about me at the moment. So.
Awesome.
Brilliant ministries, by the way. We've engaged with them a bunch of different ways.
Yes.
Including the Kings game, where in the middle of it, I've embarrassed myself twice. So Praise the Lord. That was all thanks to Tammy.
Yes.
Because I do whatever Tammy tells me to do.
Including shoot three-point shots very badly
in front
of lots of people.
That.
Didn't the other guy have like a broken leg or something?
Yeah? So what? I will take advantage of the other person.
You mean Pastor Dan Axtell, my pastor?
Oh, absolutely. Pastor Dan was completely wounded, and I took full advantage of that because if he was healthy, I would have been destroyed.
Right.
But I ended up losing the next year to someone from Jesus Culture that made me feel embarrassed as well.
Well, glad you could have that experience.
It's always about me.
Always about you. Let's make it about anything else. Anita, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm feeling better about myself already because I know that I can be embarrassed anytime soon and I can take advantage of weak and wounded people. So I'm feeling really good about myself right now. All right. So I am the owner and founder of Impact Coaching and Consulting. I do business and life coaching. And I've always been interested in women in leadership because there's so little of that right now and how to help women get to a place where their voice can be heard more.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thank you for that.
That's fantastic.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
Great. Well, so thrilled to have you with us. I know Lance and I have been looking forward to this conversation for a long time and really just grateful to you all for coming out and being a part of it and so looking forward to hearing your insights. Just by way of introduction, everybody is aware that current events have brought just tremendous attention to the problem of sexual harassment. So many public figures have been implicated in sexual abuse scandals that it'd be impossible to name them all. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who just feels like every day when I pull up the news, it's kind of like, who's it going to be today? We've had figures such as Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, Louis C.K., Matt Lauer, Charlie Rose, Garrison Keillor, and Al Franken. They've all lost their jobs or announced plans to resign over sexual misconduct. We recently had a Senate race that was dramatically affected by numerous allegations of sexual misconduct by Roy Moore. We've had 19 women come forward and accuse the President of the United States of sexual misconduct. And there have been innumerable stories of less famous government and business figures whose behavior has come to light recently. Late night talk show hosts have had just a field day skewering perpetrators and different people for this. There was, of course, Alyssa Milano started the hashtag #MeToo movement, which really shed light on the breadth of the problem. And then Time magazine named, quote, the Silence Breakers, the women behind that movement, as their person of the year. And the list goes on. Bottom line, I don't know, certainly in my lifetime, that this issue has ever been given the attention it's getting now. So my first question for the two of you, and maybe Tammy, we'll start with you and then go to Anita, is it seems like we're in the midst of a significant cultural moment. Why do you think this is happening now? And is there reason to believe that real change is going to happen?
Well, I'm going to make a bold statement and say I think it's a move of God.
Yeah.
I think it's time to sift and change, and I think that people have been holding this in for a really long time. And as I'm watching it play out, I'm excited for it. I know that seems weird. There's a lot of pain associated with it. There's a lot of background associated with it, but I think ultimately God is exposing what needs to be exposed.
Amen.
And now we're going to get an opportunity to respond.
That's so good.
Yeah, absolutely. Anita, how about you?
Well, there's no doubt that with the rise of social media and everybody being able to have a voice, that this has contributed to it. Notwithstanding a lot of the political things and the other motivations for it, but it is a good thing that it's coming out right now. I have concerns about how a lot of times when it finally comes out, the pent-up anger, pent-up frustration, things like that, radicalization of the situation sometimes takes its toll on the actual content of what we're trying to talk about. But yeah, it's definitely needed to come out.
I think that sometimes when something comes out and becomes popular, people go, wow, this is a weight. Things must be worse. And you go, oh, it was happening. We're just only talking about it now.
Right.
And so anytime there's a communication about it and bringing it to light, that's got to be a good thing, right? Because the pain was there. Now we get a chance to actually address it. So I think that's awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, you said you're excited about it, which, I mean, you sort of said that it's a little bit of an interesting way to phrase it. I think I know what you mean by that, but could you say a little bit more about that, Tammy? When you say you're excited, like what, forgetting that, excitement is an interesting word to use here, but I think, again, I know what you're saying. What is it exactly that you're excited about, or what is the potential that you see here?
Well, I think first of all, healing. So, for me personally, 20 years experience initially in the corporate world, and I've experienced this over and over and over and over again. And it is pervasive in our society and in our culture. Mm-hmm. And so the first step to healing is being able to tell your story and say it out loud and have people actually acknowledge it. Because for years, people, even though there were laws around it, women would say it out loud. They would go to their HR departments. They would say it to their pastors and their husbands and their, but I think the brevity of it that's coming out now, allowing people to see how big it is, and then allowing a conversation to happen around it that's deeper and hopefully more action-oriented will cause healing. That's what I'm excited about.
I almost wonder, I mean, I as I've been thinking about this issue, I think about just the role of honestly just ignorance. People like me, ignorant of not really recognizing just how widespread this is, just how much of a daily reality this is for women in particular. I mean, Saturday Night Live had a sketch a few weeks ago, sort of this like mock music video that they made of a bunch of women essentially saying, "Hey, welcome to our life. Like this is just what our life is." Anita, to what extent do you think that just some maybe ignorance on the part of, again, just being honest, people like me, like how much does that have to play into our inability to address the issue?
I was even shocked by, I'm sorry to say this, guys, but the ignorance of men around this as well, because I had someone reach out to me who said that his wife was all about the Me Too movement. And he was telling her, oh, you're making a bunch and, this is you're being kind of ridiculous and stuff like that. And then he reached out to me. He says, because I saw you on Facebook, you also said Me Too as well. I did a little Facebook live video on it. And he said, and when I saw you doing it, which is pathetic to think that he valued my opinion over his wife's, right? But he says, is it really that bad? And I'm like, my gosh, this is the way we've been living all along.
Yeah.
I think that because I have an unusual circumstance of how I grew up, I was always surrounded by women. So it's always been all my bosses were women, I had so many women friends, and I was raised by my mom, a single mom, and my sister was my best friend. So this is not that surprising to me. So unfortunately, it was not shocking to me.
Yeah. Now, I want to just take a moment to allow kind of each of you to share just your own personal stories, either with what you've experienced personally or what you've seen in terms of sexual harassment in either workplace or even church environments or just any other place where you've encountered it. We just want to create spaces just to hear that as before we move further into the conversation. So why don't, Anita, we'll start with you, and then Tammy will go with you.
No, I've seen it in the workplace for the most part, is where I've experienced it as well. I have not really experienced it so much as my superiors keeping me down. The other side of the coin is oftentimes, I think a lot of times when women decide that they're not going to be a part of it, they actually go into entrepreneurship to get out from underneath it.
Yep.
But yeah, I've experienced it very much so in the workplace.
Yeah.
Okay, Tammy, how about you?
Yeah, well, I've experienced it in some very detailed ways, and I think it's important to say it, and I don't have a problem saying it, so I'm going to.
Good.
Yeah, by all means.
I, started my career pathway in the insurance world, and that world is very, frankly, male-dominated. I also ran special investigative units across the nation, so that is also very male-dominated. And I didn't experience a lot of it until I reached levels of, at the time, director and above, which used to mean something. Director, vice president, president used to be a level that you worked up through. And once I, sort of pierced through those levels, the harassment became very, very power-oriented and regular. It happened multiple times. I'm not talking about, and this is sad that I'm saying this, I'm not talking about words. Women, I think, don't even call that harassment anymore because we're so used to it. That's sort of a level down here. I'm talking about pushing to a level of touching and grabbing and attempted assault. And then I think it does go further than that. I think it, permeates into our world in areas of sex trafficking and the sex trade and sexual molestation and things like that. So anyway, I've experienced multiple times, and it was reported every time. I've investigated multiple cases of women who have experienced this, and they reported it. And the fact of the matter is that it mostly went on deaf ears.
Yes.
And good for you, Tammy, that you reported it, because honestly, where it's been in my life when it's happened, I've just gone like, well, that's the way of the world, and moved right on, just letting it be because it's so pervasive.
Right.
Yep.
Why is it not taken seriously, or at least as seriously as it should be when it's reported? Do either of you? Sadly, there's any number of reasons, but I think it's important to address that in the context of the conversation.
I think there's a power culture is one of those reasons. I think that it is the same, I shouldn't say the same, but a similar conversation we might have with people of color who are being in situations where a person in power is in leadership. I think that's one of them. I think some of it is that in business, especially when money is the object and money is the reason we're there, that it becomes a cursory, let's just mitigate damage. How do we make sure we don't lose revenue over it? How do we make sure we don't lose employees over it? And it just becomes a process you go through rather than being about a person.
Well, and then when you think about the fact that I think a lot of times the sexual harassment is about power, especially at those higher levels. It's really not about sexuality so much as it is about power. And so if a woman gets that from someone who is above her and then she goes to report it, number one, she's rarely believed.
Correct.
And even if she is believed, then you get this stigma of being somebody who just makes a mountain out of a molehill. You're a troublemaker. You have no sense of humor. You can't get along. You can't play well with others in the sandbox. And so really, that's why I think a lot of times we don't see women in higher places in leadership in business, because it gets to that point. We either walk away from a job or we get a reputation. And so it is really, we're in a tough spot in that place.
Yeah, and that's just, I think that's the part of this that I just it's so sickening to me that dynamic exists where a person can be made physically uncomfortable, to have inappropriate physical things happen, to be the butt of jokes that aren't just simple teasing about whatever, but are derogatory remarks made about a person in an inappropriate way regarding their appearance or whatever the case may be, and that those who are the victims of that have to then live in fear of the repercussions. And sadly, the perpetrators more often than not, at least up to this point, don't, because of those power dynamics at play. Kind of the idea of, if you've got the power, then you just are held to a different behavioral standard than everyone else. And I just think that's incredibly destructive in a number of ways, not just in the area of harassment or sexual harassment, but just in the way you treat people. It's just no way to live your life, or no.
Let me add a layer of complexity to this. So I was newly married, don't know how many years, and I was just doing side gigs. I also went through the insurance industry early on, and so I'm very clear on how male-dominated it is. But all my bosses were women because I wasn't very high up. So just trying to say. But I did a side gig as promotions for a radio station. And so we went out to, and I only did this a couple times, we went out to a club, and the idea was to be in a dance club and just to hand out promotions and do stuff like that. And my promotions boss was a woman. And she came to me, we were all standing around talking, and she said, I'll just jump to the punchline. She came to me and she said, hey, why don't you do this for me or whatever? And I said some joke to her or whatever, and she goes, well, at some point, why don't you just take off your clothes and we can figure it out? Now,
oh, how'd that feel?
So that's the complexity, because in one sense, she had the power of, she can choose to hire me back or not hire me back.
Yep.
So she had the power structure, but there's a different nuance. I'm a 6'3" male.
Exactly.
And there's levels of this I had that did not touch me. And that's the part I think that sometimes men have a hard time attaching to, because behind her was not a massive structure that was pressing down on me. I was not a woman. I did not have that huge systematic or systemic problem battling me. Second of all, even though she could fire me, I did not feel physically intimidated by her. And so, yes, was it technically sexual harassment? Yes. Was it the same? I don't think so. Yeah. I think that there's whole layers I was not a part of. So just simply saying, how did it feel? Well, obviously it was very awkward, and we can all talk about the whole, wow, that was kind of weird. And, and was it right? No, it was wrong. But still, it's not in the same level, in the same type as what we're dealing with here. In some ways it is, but in some ways it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Any comments on that? Or?
Well, yeah, in the sense that it happened to you and you knew that she could fire you, but you also didn't have that sensation that if I go anywhere else, this is going to happen to me again and again and again.
Correct.
That's right.
It's a singled out experience.
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
Well said.
Which makes it much, much, much different. Now, speaking more kind of generally about the problem, kind of big picture, what are some ways that that issues of sexual harassment and misconduct can be handled poorly by churches or organizations? And I guess what I'm getting at in this question is not things like, well, ignore victims and shame them, like not real overt stuff like that. I guess what I'm more talking about is, what are ways that churches and organizations can just kind of have in their culture patterns that are unhealthy, even if they're not necessarily overtly bigoted or sexist or things like that.
It's even worse. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have.
No, go ahead.
It's
Go ahead.
even worse sometimes when it's not overt.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because you it's like you can't put your hands on it. Yeah. You can't get your fingers around it when somebody's saying, well, perhaps you were having a bad day. Where the implications are, it's, maybe it was that time of the month and you overreacted, things like that. Mm-hmm. That stuff happens in the church all the time.
Yeah.
And once there's even just that tiniest bit of play in there, your opinion no longer really matters.
I think the biggest example recently, some of the responses I saw online were, well, it's just an allegation.
Right.
Right? And, you immediately are dismissing whether or not it's factual. I think things like, what are you wearing? You know, what were you wearing? What did you say that caused them to do that? There's that whole blame thing that goes on towards the woman. The guy is right automatically, but there's a seed of doubt when it comes from the woman's story.
Mm-hmm. I think that part of that's really, really frustrating for me is this burden of proof, and you don't have proof when it's a verbal. There's a way to control a room without physically touching someone. There's a dominance you can do. There's an abuse you can create without there being residue of proof. And so the woman feels completely ill-equipped. If somebody goes, well, what proof do you have? What are you supposed to say? I don't have any, unless there was a camera in the room, which it almost feels like, police have body cameras nowadays. I feel like this is a woman. I would want to walk around with like a body camera, a big old huge helmet, that just kind of films everybody. And I'm like, look, see, that guy's an idiot. Look, I can tell you, Probably not realistic, guys. Sorry.
Great idea, Lance. I think we've accomplished what we came here to do.
I too am an entrepreneur.
There we go. Why is it? Because I've seen it plenty of times. Kind of what you were alluding to, Tammy. The idea of just instantly going to what did the woman do to bring that on, or whatever the case may be. Why do we so quickly go that direction? I don't feel like we do that. Like, what did the shopkeeper do to encourage theft? Like, we don't. I mean, I don't. At least that's not the first place we go. I mean, maybe eventually we say, okay, shopkeeper, let's look at some things we can do to avoid theft. But we don't. We're not looking to exonerate the thief based on what. And forgive me, this is a poor analogy, but why do we go so quickly to, well, what did she do, as opposed to going to, hey, somebody has done something awful here, and it's not the woman. Yeah, why do we do that?
Well, I'm just going to go there for a moment. I personally have experienced the church creates culture. I think that sometimes we believe in the church that the world is out there and they're creating their own culture. I would argue that we're creating it, that if people are created in God's image, they want to be like God, and they want to do what they're supposed to do, whether they're a Christian or not. That's what I'm witnessing in the area that I work in. And so I think that Eve and Adam and how we tell that story does matter. Yeah. I think it does permeate our culture, whether we believe it or not.
Yeah.
And I do think that's one of the foundational reasons people go there.
So say more about that for our listeners who might not be tracking on exactly what you're saying. How do we tell that story in a way that furthers this sort of narrative? Because it's a mistelling of the story, but it's pervasive. Correct. So it's important to talk about.
Yeah, Eve screwed it up, basically.
Yeah.
Adam wasn't playing a part in it at all, and that Eve ate the apple, and it was her fault. She screwed it up. And Eve is the reason that we, as women, continue to have to live the way we live.
Therefore, all women are the source of all problems.
That's right.
Right. Lance, correct that for us. What is a more appropriate reading of the Adam and Eve story? I know that Tammy could do it, but I just trying to get everyone involved here. What is a way, and because here's the implications of it. Obviously, as Tammy's alluded to, we tell that story wrongly, and then we extrapolate on top of that all these just insane conclusions that have massive implications that are, if not universally, very close to universally negative. How can we understand that story more accurately in a way that doesn't lead us down these sexist and inappropriate paths?
Yeah, so first of all, there's so many different levels of the story that I've talked about throughout the years, and one of them is that a lot of it is not said. So, for example, when the Hebrews read Genesis, they would all have a prior knowledge. So we try to look into the Bible and say everything's in there. It's not. And so everyone now extrapolates their own viewpoint, right? So then people are like, well, that's why, like, for example, it says, and she gave fruit to her husband who was with her, and he ate of it. Well, you don't know if it means that he was right there the whole time or he was in the garden with her. Like, so we all start making up our own stories. But one of the things that has been intriguing to me because of all the language that's behind it about how woman is created, it's a different word for her being formed than man being formed. Because of that, I personally believe that Eve was the center of wisdom in that environment, in that couple. And the reason why Satan went after her is that if he can go after her and take her down, she a lot of times is a brains of an operation. And so if he can nail her, then she can convince this other, he'll follow along. And so it's a complete flip on how a lot of people see it, as it was all male dominated and then she was the weak one. But the bottom line is that she was going up against an evil genius. She was never going to win that debate. You got Satan, you got Lucifer himself, he was called the pinnacle of creation. So it doesn't matter what human being was going to go up head to head with this guy, he was going to win, because the only answer that would ever get them out of that trouble was obedience to the voice of the Father. It's why Jesus in the temptation of the desert, he didn't reason with him. He didn't try to figure it out. He didn't do anything else. He said, my dad said no, so I'm out. That's what Eve and Adam, because they both had equal partnership in this, God gave them instructions. They were supposed to, both of them, drop the ball. But the idea was they were supposed to go, my dad said no. I can't really argue with you about it. You're right. You probably have a lot of good points, but I can't debate this with you. I don't have that ability, but my dad said no, so I can't do that. So in this, like, for example, if you look at the Old Testament, the reason why I tie all this in, and then I'll get off my little soapbox, is that in ancient Hebrew writings, wisdom is feminine.
Right.
It's so if you want to go back through, it says wisdom calls out in the streets, and it's always feminine mentioned. And so that's why I put a lot of these pieces together. So I think that the garden was very, very different than how we most assume.
And I would also suggest that just with that one story is a piece of it. And like we were talking about, wisdom is thought of as a woman. She calls out in the street, and yet that's forgotten oftentimes, or that the bride of Christ is female.
Yep.
But we look at, there's a lot of references to temptresses and people bringing mankind down, and it's the female. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of times, and this happened in my family as well, where the woman is thought that if you have been if you've been accosted sexually in any sort of way, it was because you were the temptress and you were doing something wrong.
Right. Well, and it's just like in the Adam and Eve story, it is ridiculous to think that Adam is just living his life making great decisions, and then Eve comes along and knocks him off course. I mean, as Lance has alluded to, that's just plainly false. Similarly, the narrative of, well, if women would just behave in a certain way, then men would not behave badly. I mean, no.
It's not just our culture. No. I mean, look at the Muslim culture and what they do to women and the burqas and all of that stuff. I mean, it's...
Yeah, it's worldwide.
Absolutely.
Let me just highlight one more thing on this. Some people listening may go, that's just one story. But if you go all the way back even to Paul's teachings, he refers back to the Adam and Eve story. And so it's actually laced throughout the entire culture. How you view that story actually has massive ramifications in all areas of the Bible. So just want to highlight how significant that was. Yep. So Tammy, when you were bringing it out, that's why you brought it out. It's that big of a deal.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about this issue of power, not so much workplace dynamic power necessarily, but as I've been reading the news, especially as I've been seeing the reactions people have to different individuals who get implicated in this, and how oftentimes people's reactions vary significantly, not based on the severity of the offense, but based on, well, do I like that person or not?
Right.
How does power, both a desire for power and then sort of a, for lack of a better word, a deification of those in power, how do those things prevent us from taking sexual harassment seriously?
So the idea then, if I'm well-liked, if I'm a male and I'm well-liked and somebody comes up to me, then if somebody accuses me, then I'm very unlikely to have that stick. Whereas if I'm not well-liked, frankly, I think that that's just a matter of power, whether it's female or male.
Right.
If someone's being taken down from this simply because they're not liked, then everybody's going to jump on that one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's all I've got to say on that.
That's probably true. Tammy, any thoughts on that?
No.
I mean, I do think that they're part of the challenge that I think that victims have, and I'm speaking from somewhat of a place of ignorance because I myself have never been a victim, but I think part of the challenge victims have is if I am treated inappropriately by a well-liked person, whether that is a business leader or a celebrity or a pastor or a political official, then the people, say, who attend the church, or the people who are a member of that person's political party, or the people who love that person's product or their comedy routine, or whatever the case may be, they're not going to believe me. And I think that is incumbent upon us as the public to, first of all, recognize our own willingness to sort of look past sexual harassment if it is going to paint somebody that we want them in power, or we really like what they've done. We're going to be more inclined to ignore that stuff if it's going to affect somebody that we think is really great. And to me, that's a problem, especially if you're a real honest victim. That creates structures that make it really difficult to be heard.
Well, I think that's the whole reason why things washed out the way they did. Harvey Weinstein is not a liked figure.
No, he's not.
Bottom line, no one came out and was like, dang, that's an awesome dude. That never happened. And that's why it stuck. I think these allegations have been constantly spoken of over and over and over again. You don't lead with Kevin Spacey. You don't lead with Donald Trump. You don't lead with figures that are a bit more liked by certain populations, right? You don't lead with I don't want to start throwing out names that are not as happy. All right, almost got myself in trouble. Dang it.
Breaking news reported by Lance Hahn.
But I do believe this is the reason why it began to take off practically, is because we had a figure that everyone was sick and tired of, and he had no redeeming qualities. And so everyone was like, okay, we're done. Well, then once that ball got started, now some shiny guys got drug in. You don't lead with Matt Lauer. Matt Lauer has to be brought in as a secondary portion of the conversation because he was liked more initially.
It's an interesting thought.
Yeah. No, that is, but I think there's some truth to that openness to more likable figures probably did increase because people who had less of positive affiliation would were noted first. Now we've talked a little bit about how some poor theology and a poor understanding of the Adam and Eve story can affect the way we view this issue. Not long after #MeToo came out, there was #ChurchToo as well. People detailing really horrific accounts of sexual harassment, even sexual abuse that they experienced in a church setting. It's a very real issue. In what ways can churches inadvertently create cultures where sexual harassment is not taken seriously?
Well, I'll take that one on.
Yeah.
I think, first of all, the biggest one that I see is this whole idea of we'll handle it in the church.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a real thing.
It's a real thing. As a former investigator and understanding what that world looks like, I will tell you that about 97% of cases against churches and pastors do not ever go to court. And the reason why is because people are fearful of taking those to the next step. And so, unfortunately, I think there is this idea of grace that steps in. Well, let's have grace on him. And the woman is supposed to go along with that, and she does. And I think what usually happens is that the female doesn't get an opportunity to be heard, and I don't think people really understand the long-term ramifications for her in protecting and handling in the church the aggression by the guy. And so it becomes a soul wound. It becomes something that never goes away for the woman because her own church now has basically rejected her in that. And I've seen that happen over and over and over again. I hate to say it, but I could name, which I won't, multiple folks in the church right now in our ministry who have come to us over and over and over again in regards to things that have occurred, and they are still being protected inside of their churches because they're going to handle it.
And if it's that pervasive, it makes me ask the question, is handled code for ignored?
Yes, it is. Absolutely is.
Yeah.
Or dismissed.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Because sometimes if it's not ignored, but it's dismissed, the idea that the woman is all about hysteria, right? Because that's what we get a lot is if we say something to somebody and we say, this hurt, this is not good, then it's the idea that, well, you're a little hysterical right now. So we can't take you as seriously as we might take the man.
Right. Right. I think that even gets into the whole subject of kind of microaggression and the vocabulary we use, that if a male is forceful, he's a strong leader. If a female is forceful, there are different words that are used. And it's just like, really?
Right.
If a male brings something to light, maybe he's a whistleblower, he's a hero. And thankfully, I think this movement is starting to change that a little bit on the female end, but you're certainly right that has largely been thought of as, oh, she's hysterical, she's, this and that. Now, the answer to this question is maybe obvious, but I want to sort of get it on the record, so to speak, just so we can address it clearly. Instead of just handling it, like you say, what can churches do to be better about this and to take it seriously? Either of you.
I think you can have grace and truth together. Yeah. I think you can have grace for the person and for the people, and you can process what's happening in the church. I think that's a good thing, but that should not replace turning the individual in or reporting it to the proper authorities or allowing for the woman to have a criminal case if that's what occurred.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One thing just to highlight out, when we were doing some prep for this, Pastor Brian, you fired out a bunch of different resources. And one of them was a Facebook post by Jen Hatmaker. And what she talked about is forgiveness, that under the term forgiveness means sweeping it under the rug. And so just from a pastor's perspective, I want to be real clear on what forgiveness means. Forgiveness does not mean becoming a doormat. Forgiveness does not mean a removal of boundaries. Forgiveness does not mean removal of accountability. That you can hold someone accountable and go through the proper processes and forgive. So this whole idea that, because that becomes another spiritual abuse. If somebody starts saying, I'm going to quiet you by using biblical language because I'm really trying to get to something else, but I can use certain scriptures out of context to be able to shun you or push you down. And one of those is things like forgiveness, right? Well, you should just have grace. You should just forgive. You know what? Everybody has some challenges, right? These types of things.
Right.
And I will tell you, I've been part of some mediations in the church where there are processes in place where the word forgiveness actually means, okay, we're done, let's move on.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is to me, to define it in that way is to do violence on the term and the concept, because that's not what it's meant to be at all. And if anything, that completely hijacks what forgiveness, in my opinion, is meant to accomplish, which is ultimately some measure of restoration for the victim and the perpetrator. But you can't have forgiveness if you're merely going to victims and saying, hey, you don't usually use this language, but hey, we're not going to do anything about the perpetrator, but you just feel better.
And we're not going to do anything about the perpetrator because we're going to tell you, we're going to spiritualize this and tell you that you're not a good Christian if you don't.
Yeah. That is blasphemy. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, just addressing some of the articles that you gave. We had two articles that really gave some practical tips on what church can do, just highlighting those out. We had an article from the Missio Alliance and an article from Sojourners. And the Missio Alliance article said that the 4 things they think church should do is accept and believe the magnitude of the problem, preach, teach, and talk regularly about it, set clear guidelines and provide safe channels of communication, and invite those who are ready to share their stories and be healed. That was the Missio Alliance. The other one on Sojourners was address sexual violence to the church regularly, which means age appropriately. Remember, it was talking about even for the younger ages, you would talk about treating girls as equals, respecting personal boundaries. You don't have to go all crazy and age inappropriate, right? Number 2 was don't neglect sexual violent Bible passages. You forget a lot of this is in there. right? I mean, the Bible is not quite always safe for the whole family, right?
No.
There's some pretty brutal stuff in there, and God addresses it. Number 3, bring women into upper levels of leadership in the church. And then that was a sojourner. And then number 4, don't be parties to help keep it quiet. So just as a side note, those were some things that were brought up.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I think speaks to some of what the two of you are describing, and that kind of the idea of churches being co-conspirators in the sense of keeping it silent. No, we can't do that. I mean, Jen Hatmaker addresses that in her Facebook post. And to spiritualize things in a way that leads to silence and allows evil to continue is just wrong. And when that's done in the name of Jesus, again, like, it's a strong word, but I don't think it's too strong. It's blasphemous. It is bringing reproach upon the church, and more importantly, reproach upon the name of Jesus, which has just devastating consequences, right? So.
When I was reading those articles, some of the things, if you'll forgive me for saying this, that I read about what can the church do just really felt kind of weak.
Empty
Agreed.
And weak. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Tammy. All right. Because she's the other woman.
There you go.
The part about having women in more leadership positions, I think, really does help. Because here's the thing that I look at when I talk about with women in leadership to other women. I'll talk about the fact that like 14% of all really powerful positions in the world, between 14 and 18%, if you look at it, are only being held by women. What's people in politics, CEOs, all kinds of stuff. And it's not that it's evil that men are the other 84 to whatever percentage, but it's simply that the female voice is just not where leadership hears it. There is such an inequality of just the perspective.
Yeah.
And so, churches have had issues about having women in leadership, and I'm hoping that some of that will change.
Yeah.
Because we need to have that voice.
Right, and I think the ramifications from that are that means what percentage of the wealth in our country, even in the world, is in the hands of a man. So when we're trying to take care of our communities and take care of our children, we are still having to go to someone who owns the money to be able to do that. So the ramifications in our culture are much deeper than just put somebody in a token position.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
If it's not authentic, it's not that's not going to do the trick.
Right. If there's not real power, real influence, real authority, then it is. It's a token position, which is worthless, whether we're talking about gender or race or anything else. And for what it's worth, as a male, I mean, I completely agree. I don't think this problem is going to be solved in the church world until the church has a serious reckoning with the question of women in leadership.
Right.
And to me, I almost like that conversation. To me, is so important. But it's also, to be honest with you, it's a little bit uncomfortable for me, only because, and hear me out.
I'm just looking at you.
Only because, to me, the fact that the conversation is even necessary.
Yeah, can you imagine that? But you know how you asked at the beginning of the interview, do you believe that change can truly happen? And I do, because if you look back, Tammy, you alluded to this earlier. This is not unlike when blacks were having to be given where we had to have the conversation. Are they actually humans like us, right? Or women's suffragists? Do they get to vote? Things like that. And we've made progress. So I think that there's hope for this. I just also think there's going to be a backlash for a while.
Yeah. Now say more about that. What the backlash you're referring to? What are you fearful of in that regard?
Well, when you look, even Martin Luther was looked at as a radical when he nailed the
very much so,
right,
yeah.
all of that. So right now we have a lot of women who are speaking up who are angry, and I mean really angry, and it does not bode well for the fact, and this is something that I am concerned about, is how will men now react? Will they be absolutely scared to death to do anything, right? Not all of this is going to be fixed by laws, right? But we're probably going to have it for a while where the pendulum's going to swing the wrong way for a bit. It's going to go too far.
That sort of anger, I think you're right. It can cause things to get a little bit out of balance. It's funny. I was talking to actually one of our colleagues right before we came in here, who is a female, and I was kind of articulating a similar idea of, okay, I want even us on this podcast or us as a church, I want us to be able to speak prophetically into this issue. I want to speak God's truth into the issue. And I feel that way about a number of social causes. And I wrestle with, how do you speak prophetically without going into speaking in a way that is fueled by anger, or at least where anger is interpreted to the point where instead of inspiring soul searching, inspiring compassion, inspiring a desire to rethink the way that I view the world, it just creates backlash and anger. And that's hard, especially when it's just, I mean, how much more emotionally charged can you get than what we're talking about today, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do think we need to give some women a moment to be angry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, frankly.
That is part of the process.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a season of that. But, if we're going to speak prophetically, I really believe that what God's doing here is bringing together men and women in a balance the way that it should be.
Mm-hmm.
If we react to this the same way we did in the early 70s and it becomes about women overpowering men, then we're going to have the same issue on the male side,
Right.
in 5 to 10 years. And that's really not God's kingdom view. So I really believe that as we start to come together, there is a place for Christian women to be able to speak this through a biblical perspective in the balance of the kingdom.
Amen. Absolutely. Tammy, you shared with us an article that you wrote detailing some of your experience, and then you listed at the end of it just a number of ways, kind of, this is what healing can look like. This is how we can move forward. And I want to talk about a few of these different items that you listed. This was just a fantastic list. And one of them that you wrote, I'm just so interested in hearing you say more about was, and then Anita would absolutely love for you to weigh in as well. You said that men need to adjust to a world where they're mutually respected for who God made them to be, and that our men are suffering an identity crisis as well. I agree. I want to hear you say more about that, just to kind of unpack that. What is the identity crisis you're referring to, and kind of what does it look like to make the adjustments you're talking about?
Yeah, I think in general, we have put both men and women in a box. Mm-hmm. And God's box is not that small.
Yeah.
We are all different. There's diversity in both male and female. Mm-hmm. And I think that we have said men have to be strong warriors. They got to be the lead of the family. They have to be the ones making the money. If they're not, they're failing. They've got to be the CEO. I work with lots of guys who are COOs, and they hang their heads all the time in shame because they've been shamed that they're not good enough. I think that we have to reposition both sides of this. We've gotten into a system that we have both created, frankly. We haven't talked about the woman side of this in regards to how we created part of this ourselves. I know that probably won't be heard very well, but I did investigate a lot of these cases, and there is legitimacy to trying to move up the ladder by making things happen with your sexuality too. That's another podcast probably. But I do think that there's a balance, and men have been caught up in this as well. And so elevating our men who are more quiet, who are more, artists, and giving them a place in our world as well, I think is going to be part of this process, or needs to be.
Yeah, that's good. Anita, any thoughts?
Yeah, let me just go ahead. I mean, if you're going to if you're throwing yourself under the bus, I'm going to throw myself under the bus, and the two of us can just lie there together and over together.
Good job, Anita.
All right, way to go.
Right. Okay, but in some ways we have perpetrated this, and especially within the church, because we continue to present the female as being this, like, a glorified teenager, right? A lot of times if I try to go to women's stuff at church, I'm like, I don't want to do decoupage. That's not interesting to me, right? Or only talking about, like, mops and things like that, where the woman is only seen as either this cute little thing that makes the home or the mother, and we're not seen as something beyond that. And there are definitely differences in male-female, how we do it. There's some of the reasons that women are not in leadership have to do with their choice for family over work. I get that. But we've got to start looking at, and even the women in the church need to start recognizing other women as being intelligent with something to say.
Yeah, I would say I get as many comments from women calling me some of those same names that the guys do as I do men. So when we speak like a man speaks, especially in business and in leadership, just as many women think the same way.
Yeah. Huh. Wow. Lance, I know you've done a lot of study and research into just the idea of sort of these gender stereotypes, for lack of a better term, to kind of allude to what you're referring to, Anita. And I even know, for what it's worth, I mean, I've even seen the way that we've advertised men's ministry things before, and there's lots of sort of explosions and all this other stuff. And I'm kind of like, okay, if you're into that, fine, but like, I'm a man and I'm really not. Like, all of this like war and fighting, no, like that doesn't really do it. For like, there's complexity to what it means to be a man, much like I think you would. And again, if someone's into that stuff, that's fine. Much like I would imagine, what I want to make sure I'm representing what you said properly, Anita. For women who are into kind of these types of environments, that's wonderful. We just need to recognize that's not all there is.
Right.
Is that
Right.
Exactly.
Yes.
so? Lance, can you speak to that a little bit? Because I know I've heard you talk before about just sort of recognizing diversity within gender in terms of realizing that not all men are the same and not all women are the same, and you can have a range of interests and still be feminine and still be masculine, and that can look different.
Yeah, it's a big deal to me. Which, by the way, thanks for inviting me, Brian, for decoupage later.
Hey,
that was
you got
super
it.
cool of you.
You and
I
me,
appreciate
we'll
that.
do it. It'll be
Send me a
fun.
postcard.
Yeah. So my thoughts on this issue is that it is causing havoc. It always has. It's being recognized a little bit more. It's wreaking havoc in a bunch of different areas. One of those areas is the gender discussion, which is male and female. The other one has to be in the LGBT discussions, because when we so narrowly define and stereotypically define male and female, what we're doing is we're forcing people out of categories.
Right.
And so, if you are not a male that likes explosions and works on cars and everything else, you may well be a different gender. And that type of pressuring, as much as somebody won't say overtly that's what they mean, that's exactly what they're saying. And nowadays, for a long time, people just lived in frustration. Nowadays, there are categories that are opening up that have a cool factor to them where people are running to, because they've been shamed in the category they're at. So if you're a male and you don't act male, there are now new places that you can go. My problem is I don't think that's at all what God intended. I think that God is saying, listen, you don't understand my creativity. My creativity is brilliant. So if I'm going to create female, I'm going to pour myself out, the female of me, I'm going to pour out into women. I'm going to do so in such a beautifully creative, vast, different way. Some women are going to be like, you know what? I want to be a Navy SEAL. Personally, I would rather just be out in the field, and I want to go take care of business in that way. And then you have extraordinary nurturing capabilities of saying, I like babies, and I'm not going to apologize for that.
Right.
Quite frankly, I'm really good at my job. And if we're going to have any healthy kids in this world, I'm probably going to be at the helm. And then you have ladies that are saying, you know what, I'm much more into intellectual pieces and I want to go this direction. The bottom line is it's vast. The same thing happens with men. Is that why can't somebody who maybe is a little bit more effeminate in how they operate and things like that, why is that not still male? We call it effeminate as if it's female, but what if the affections are not negative? They are simply a part of design. And so anyway, I'm really big on that, so I'll stop talking. Now it's quiet.
Yeah, any thoughts on that?
I like that.
Yeah.
And I feel kind of bad because I've never really thought about it that much with men. I know I think about it all the time as a woman because I represent a really small percentage of the population of women that, get out and say, I want to be in business. I want to do this. I want to do that. I don't represent a high part of the population for females. So never really thought about it with men either.
I've watched this in the high school setting. My husband's a high school teacher where kids in high school now are choosing
Absolutely.
where they're going to be based on their identity because they cannot relate to the label that has been given to them.
Yes. And so now you drop in, you were talking about pendulum swings. The church is a super weird place because in one sense, it's male dominated. And so we were talking about some of the things women are thought of as weak and not critical thinkers, and women are emotional and exaggerate, and Father God is male and Jesus is male. So male is the only legitimate way, and men are better leaders and stronger in character, right? So in one sense, the church is totally distorted on that side, but yet there is a feminization of the church that swung the other side, which is it actually does not lean into, it leans far better into traditional women categories. For example, we're taught to, in the church, talk about our feelings. Actually, women, as they're raised, little girls will tend to communicate slightly better than little boys. Well, then they're way ahead of the game. So the minute they step into the church, they're like, boom, let's go. You know, like, I have no problem talking about this. I know how I'm doing. And guys are way behind. Then you're talking about reading the Bible. Stereotypically, women read more than men read. So a lot of the church actually, even in popular culture, some beautiful things happened where everyone was like, well, men are for business. And they created a lonely hierarchy structure. And all of a sudden, women got into the workforce and created this coffee shop backlash of going, whatever happened to a round table, folks? Hey, shouldn't we all talk about this? Now, which was healthier? I think both are healthy, but we were way too off on one side. The church does the same thing.
Yeah, we love our pendulums. It's very strange, but it makes it hard to find healthy balance in a lot of these issues because kind of reaction and overreaction and all of that, it gets us into trouble. We're coming up on the end here, and I've got like 18 more questions I want to ask you, ladies. So we're not going to get to all of them.
That was quick,
but
too.
I know. But you said something, and you agreed a minute ago, and I want to return to it because I don't want to just go by it. And that is, you were saying how we had read a few articles talking about how the church can respond, and that you found kind of what was offered in those articles to be insufficient, to be weak. This is such a critical issue. Weak is not good enough, right?
No,
so I want to hear from you. How can the church be better? What are some practical steps that local churches can take to addressing this issue sufficiently, so that, anyways, just so we can eradicate it, frankly, from our church cultures. Would love to hear from either of you or both of you.
I think one practical way how about spend the next 40 days talking about the women in the Bible?
Mm-hmm. Just a greater attention,
right,
to women in the Bible.
I think some things like having a conversation, discussion, like Lance has led several times with different issues, so that women can speak to it. But ultimately, it's got to be about action. If it's all rhetoric and it's all conversation and then nothing happens from it and nothing changes, then it really doesn't accomplish. It's shallow.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that there's a box that you can check that's going to make this get fixed, right?
No.
Yeah.
The idea of talking about the women in the Bible. Okay, here I go again, man. Maybe I'm going to edit this out, baby. But you know how you go to the women's Bible studies and, it's going to be about Ruth, or it's going to be about, and so can we have one about Deborah, please?
Yeah.
Amen.
Amen.
We love
Let's
Deborah.
do it.
What's the name of that gal
She
that
was hardcore.
drove us?
JL.
Right? Yeah, JL. Man, she was awesome.
Yeah.
Can we have some of that where it shows women in a position of leadership? And this is not about dominance. It's just showing that the woman has a sense of logic and power and leadership capabilities. But we have to, I think the biggest thing, and again, this is not you because you can't check this box, is for women to be believed and for women to be recognize that abuse is not just physical.
Yeah.
It is the psychological abuse that happens through the physicality or whatever. But women are going to need to start being believed.
Yeah. 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 No, you're absolutely right. And I appreciate what you said about how this is not a box to check. This is not an item on a list. This isn't let's solve this problem so we can move on. This, like so many other issues, this is a culture shift. This is a mentality change for men and for women. And I appreciate what you said about women need to be believed. They need to be empowered to believe when they tell their stories, they're going to be heard. And then men, or even other women, as you have described, just need to be prepared to hear those stories and not go to these kind of sexist ways that we dismiss victims. And I like what you said about action. I'm looking here at an article that we all read by Nick Kristof, where he was interviewing a number of ladies, and I don't recall if it was Sheryl Sandberg from Facebook, but somebody basically said, you need to take action. One firing will do more than 1,000 sensitivity trainings, right?
Real quick,
Please.
Speaking of Sheryl Sandberg, because I liked her book Lean In, but at the end, I did not like that she basically left it to the men to be the ones who would bring women up the ladder. However, within the church, at least, I think that this is not something that women can fix. We can expose the problem, but men are going to have to tell men how to behave.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to work with women.
Yeah.
Well, and I think men are going to have to ask women to speak up, because I'm not sure we're going to hear from the church on this, because women are going to be more afraid to speak.
Yeah. So men need to invite women to speak up. Men, I think you're right. I think you talk about sort of a what do you praise, what do you shame kind of mentality.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that amongst men, there does need to be a sense in which inappropriate treatment of anybody who you like in any sort of a power play, whether we're talking about position, whether we're talking about gender, race, anything, that's just inappropriate. That's not something we celebrate and laugh at. That's something we shame. And when it's shamed, things begin to change. Now, as we start to wrap up, and I want to hear from all three of you on this. You both beautifully segued us into my last question here, and have addressed it a little bit already. But what kind of unique roles do men and women have to play in affecting real change when it comes to sexual harassment? Because we all have a part to play in this. How are maybe the roles of men and women similar, and how are they different?
I think we all need to expect something different together. So I was going to say this earlier, instead of looking at things as either or, we have to start looking at it as both and appreciating the entire spectrum of who we are. But one of the things I think is most tangible is both expecting to sit at a table with the opposite sex and have it be a table that looks like the kingdom or looks like our environment.
Yeah.
I've been the only woman in the room with a bunch of guys
Multiple
for a
times.
lot of years.
Yeah.
And I've never considered until I got involved in some of the racial reconciliation conversations that part of the problem was me not demanding. I mean, I'll be kind about it, but demanding, like Deborah, that there would actually be some other women at the table. And I've started to say no to invites where I get an email that is 10 men who are going to speak and they want me to come and watch them. And I get those every single day. And
Doesn't
I'm
that
kind of over
sound
it.
fun?
Come and applaud us,
right.
man.
If there's not as many women on that email as there are men and people of color, I'm not going to participate.
Yeah.
And I think we can all do things like that.
Yeah. No, that's great. Good stuff. Anita, how about you?
Remind me of
other
the
than
question.
other than
What was the question again,
other
Deborah?
than yes and amen. I know that just the roles that men and women can play in being part of the solution here.
One of the things that I think is that women are going to have to start recognizing that this is actually not supposed to be normal behavior.
Yeah.
Okay, we all understand rape's not okay, but so that we will actually begin to call it out.
Yeah.
Men are going to have to get to the point where they're going to believe women over men. And hopefully, this is just overly simplistic, but hopefully we're not going to have this huge backlash with the pendulums. It can kind of come together, but really it's about respect.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Lance, how about you? What do you have to add?
I think that it's about a delicate partnership, because the reality is sexuality is a real thing, and it can distort or it can be done right. And I think that men and women are handling it both very, very improperly. And if we don't partner together and trying to figure out how to change the conversation, because here's the deal, if you're a woman and the only way for you to get ahead is to use your sexuality, and you don't have the maturity or the strength to be able to say, I'm not going to do that, a lot of women have done that. And so it's created a symbiotic, weird, creepy culture where everything's, women are saying, well, then I am sexualized. I finally got my cash. I finally got my power. Meanwhile, you messed up every other woman behind you. And yet you got all these guys going, well, she's already presented herself to me as a sex object, so I'm going to see you the same way. And we miss, we miss the fact that guys they handle things slightly different, and they're not mature. They're not handling it well. And so they're doing really terrible, terrible things. So if the men are not having conversations about going, guys, what in the world is wrong with you? Like, what are you doing? And in many ways, I hold everybody accountable for this.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think that when men pull men aside, it's the idea of going, I don't care what that woman does. When she walks into your presence, you are a man of God. That means you handle things the way that Jesus would handle them. I don't care if she walks in naked into the room. You handle her like Jesus. That's how it works. Well, if I'm going to talk to a bunch of women, I'm going to talk the other side.
Right.
Ladies, we are not walking into the lion's den covered in meat. That is a terrible idea. Let's not do that because this is brutal. These guys are not mature enough. They cannot handle things, And so I just feel like in terms of having everyone partner together in these conversations of going, guys, how do we stop letting the enemy win on all this stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a way in training maturity into men. And there's a way of training wisdom into women that is different than victim shaming and different than saying it's your fault. Like we can do all of that, and that is possible. And I think, Anita, to your point, I love what you said. It's so simple, but simple doesn't mean easy. It just comes down to respect. Right. It comes down to respect. Tammy, I love what you said, kind of the last thing on your list, which I thought was so powerful. And I would hope that any woman that would hear this would know, certainly any woman at Bridgeway would know that this is absolutely our heart. And you said, ladies, no more silence. Bring it to light. I pray for supernatural healing for our sisters and brothers who have been silenced. Satan is the author of oppression.
Amen.
Amen. And he's not going to win. He's not going to win. So thank you to both of you so much for coming on and being a part of this conversation. Thank you to you as well, Lance. Thank you for your leadership in the different ways that you do, and just being a voice. I know our listeners will appreciate it very much. And just grateful for your stories and for your time. Thank you to you for listening. We created this podcast to provoke conversation around really important cultural issues. So we hope that this episode has served that purpose for you. Would encourage you to get with others, discuss this content, and work together in figuring out, males and females, how we can all be a part of the solution. Have an amazing, amazing, amazing Christmas season celebrating the birth of our Savior. We'll be back with you with the next episode of Engaging Culture, the first week of the new year. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Engaging Culture, a podcast by Bridgeway Christian Church. If you enjoyed this show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening. Music is used under the Creative Commons license and is provided by Dexter Britton.